Hello. So my name is Becca Dwyer, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Japan. I know Japan isn't traditionally what we were kind of thinking of when it came to this policy project and country project in general. But so I wanted to talk a little bit, I guess, in the beginning about why I chose Japan, and you'll be able to see more about why I think this country is super interesting as far as agriculture. They have a few challenges that are pretty unique, and I'm really excited to share that with you. So, basically, the reason that I care about Japan and their ag policies is I actually have a fairly extensive family history in Asia. My grandparents lived in China for 8 years while I was growing up. My father traveled once 1 week out of every four to Asia for years when I was little, all over, whether it was Vietnam, Thailand, China, um, Japan, obviously. My uncle actually studied abroad in Japan for a year when he was in college, and then he ended up marrying a Japanese woman who has been a major part of our family, obviously, for quite a while. And they now live in Vietnam. And this kind of comes full circle. I was exposed to Asian cultures at a young age. Haruko, my aunt, her parents spoke very little English, so every time that they came over, um, it was a really interesting experience in general, whether it comes to, bowing in cultures, showing general respect for elders, a whole bunch of different things. They regularly send us gifts and treats, traditional Japanese gifts and treats at all the holidays. They get really excited over burger and pizza joints, just things that we always, of course, take for granted here in America because they're everywhere and it's a very Americanized food. And then I also grew up with a lot of Asian lifestyle practices, whether it's wearing like house shoes versus outside shoes, but like always wearing slippers in the house, a lot of different things. But food in particular is something that always really stood out, and I didn't think about it when I was a kid, but now I realize how lucky I was to be exposed to this culture like that. Especially because it wasn't something that's part of my family's heritage naturally. So it was something that was kind of brought in and that we all absorbed really well. But regularly eating sushi, modified different types of sushis as appetizers for, before Thanksgiving or Christmas meals. Tempura was a regular treat, especially if we're going to my aunt and uncle's house, then, and they lived in the same town as me, so we interacted regularly. My cousin's lunches, often seaweed and rice with maybe another vegetable, but Haruko basically would tell us that seaweed and rice is the Japanese version of peanut butter and jelly. It's just a staple kids lunch item, and you basically just pinch off some of the sticky rice and you wrap it in like a seaweed roll and you eat it. It's actually really good, and I didn't realize that other people didn't eat that until I was a lot older. Um, they generally just grew up with a lot of rice, vegetables, and meat as staple items, not a lot of processed foods, especially breads or sandwiches. So, grew up with kind of a more traditional Asian style influence with some of that. And so now now that you have a little bit of background about some of the experiences that I've seen personally with Japanese culture and some of the way that they view food and agriculture, I want to talk about the country in general. So, some basic demographics of Japan. They have 3.3 million people considered undernourished, but they do have zero severely food insecure people. So, there are people that are struggling in that country, but for the most part, the government doesn't allow anything to get so severe that people are in life-threatening conditions due to a lack of food. So, this is one thing that I find absolutely fascinating about this country, and it's basically the opposite of what we see in the U.S. Their food self-sufficiency as a nation is actually only 39%. So they only produce 39%, like as a nation, they only produce 39% of what their country consumes. The rest is all entirely imports. U.S. is a net exporter when it comes to agricultural products, and ag products are actually I think they might actually be the highest like net export that the US has as far as like types of commodities. Um, so we don't really understand what that means. It's hard to put that in perspective, but basically we we produce all of our food here. If the rest of the world went to garbage, we would still be able to eat, and we would still have enough food production within our own country, regardless of whatever else happened, that we would be okay. Japan is completely, for the most part, dependent on all of the imports that they have. They're really, really high up on the index of net importers. So some of this is due to some geographic challenges that I'll talk about in a little bit, and also changing diets and changing demand in Japanese diets that it doesn't fit traditional Japanese production practices, nor does it fit traditional Japanese diets that they've had as a culture for centuries. So I'll talk about that a little as well. So first I want to jump into Japanese geography. Roughly, Japan as a country has the same land area as California. And to compare countries between US and California, Japan has 145,000, almost 146,000 square miles. US has 3,600,000 square miles. So big land difference. But when you look at it, the population of Japan is 125 million, and our US population is not really that much higher. So we have way more land than them. I mean, we're at, over 3.5 million. They're at less than 200,000 square miles. So huge proportion differences, and yet our population, they have over a third of our population. So that in itself is a huge challenge. They do not have the land, the resources that we do here when it comes to that. So Japan, I always pronounce this wrong, archipelago. Anyway, they're a chain of islands. There are four main. There's Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, and there are thousands of small islands surrounding. Also, I apologize if I mispronounce some of these Japanese words. It's not intentional. I'm just not great at pronunciation. Only 11.5% of that is arable land. So not only do they have a lot less land than us, but they also have a smaller percentage of land that's actually usable for ag production. So they have a lot of mountainous terrain in Japan. Japan actually has 10% of the world's active volcanoes, which is a big issue as well when it comes to earthquakes and things like that. It's heavily forested, and the few rivers that they do have, mind you, they're an island, so they can get around in boats in other ways, but the few rivers that they do have within the islands are not navigable for the most part. So climate is similar in latitude, somewhat to Washington State. For some reason, I always think of Japan, you think islands, you think more tropical. For some reason, I always put like this picture of almost like the Vietnam War in my head as to what I would think of Japanese climate: hot, tropical, really intensely humid, and that is not true. That's not true at all. So southern currents on the Pacific side warm up oceanic temperatures, keep things a little bit warm. The Kurile current moves south towards Hokkaido from the north, and that cools a lot of water and brings nutrients down from the north and is actually pretty beneficial for fishing. So climate plays a big role as to what island you're on, what side of the island you're on, and what your ag production is even possibly going to look like. Fisheries are big. Obviously, if you didn't know, seafood is huge when you're surrounded by oceans. That's a big source of protein for you. Let's see. So there are also North Asian winds that blow onto northwestern Japanese lands, which bring really heavy snows. So most of your heavily populated areas are not in that northwestern Japanese region, just because it's really intense snow. We're talking a lot more snow than, definitely not what I had mentioned earlier, picturing like a Vietnam type idea with humidity and high tropical temperatures. That's not what we're talking about here. The rest of Japan tends to have mostly dry winters. So there's just really that northwest region that really hits high amounts. And then the eastern shores experience all four seasons, similar to the US really. They have fall, spring, summer, winter, but they also have an addition of like a 1 month rainy season. This is actually really important for rice production. It helps, it's what enables them to be such efficient rice producers. And so I just wanted to mention that because rice is one of their big commodities. They do experience some major tidal wave type issues from regular earthquakes. There are some estimates that approximately every 3 days, scientists can actually measure earthquakes in Tokyo. Mostly minor, but they do have some really major earthquakes, and we've seen that in the past 10 years. They've had some pretty big ones. They also can experience typhoons moving out from the South Pacific, so a few challenges that we don't necessarily deal with here in the Midwest, but other parts of the U.S. do experience some of these problems. Japanese government is really fascinating too. There's a lot of major differences between Japanese governmental policy with agriculture and the U.S. So in general, Japan is the world's largest net importer of agricultural products. There's a recent shift to promoting aggressive agriculture for export in Japan also. So what they do produce there, and they do produce efficiency, they're really kind of starting to make a shift to pushing hard to exporting that out. Excess to what, the demand is within their own country. Japan in general, basically a constitutional monarchy. They've got an emperor. That emperor appoints a prime minister and a chief justice. Kind of reminds me of England, in a way, sort of the structure. And then there's the National Diet, I think is how you pronounce it, with a House of Representatives and a House of Counselators. Anyway, so that's kind of split similar to our Congress. And they have a Supreme Court as well. So ag-specific policies, they participated in the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, so CPTPP, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically, that has a lot of major goals that are indicating some of that shift I mentioned in ag policies. And so the goal is for pork tariffs to be eliminated in Japan within 10 years since the agreement was reached. So that's a big one. Japan imports a ton of pork, as do a lot of Asian countries in general. You might have seen that recently with some of the talk of how even like the Chinese trade war with the US has impacted hog production. So pretty big deal to eliminate the pork tariffs in Japan. Beef tariffs are supposed to be reduced within 15 years. Again, good. Definitely helps us as far as like from a US perspective being able to export to them. Their canola oil tariffs are going to be eliminated within 5 years. They're a big user of canola oil. It's a big part of cooking for us as well, but they do use a lot of canola oil in their cooking. And then wheat and barley quotas are supposed to be improved. They're also expecting to see some fish and seafood tariff reductions. They do produce a lot of their own fish and seafood though, so that's not as big of a deal from a US perspective. So they have a Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Foreign Affairs. They have a lot of border measures and domestic policies, including direct payments. So specifically, they have some producer quotas, which mostly focuses on dairy. So they have a dairy council. Basically, the whole point is controlling milk production means more stable prices in their market. And then the dairy producers actually receive a direct payment from the government per liter of milk. They have income stabilization policies, which they use pretty much to protect vegetable production if prices drop lower than a historical average. And that covers soybeans, milk, rice, fruits, and vegetables. They have deficiency payments, which are a little bit different. They basically pay all or part of the difference between a target price and the market price. The government sets the target price, and that applies only to beef calves, soybeans, and pork. They have a rice diversion program, which is really interesting. I think this is one of the big policies that maybe we will see going away now that they're trying to push more of that aggressive agricultural export side of things. But the rice diversion program basically paid farmers to take their rice fields out of production. So they were concerned about oversupply in the market, which would drop the price of rice down and really hit some of the rice producers pretty hard financially. And basically they just were trying to stop that market from being flooded with oversupply because rice is so economically enticing. And so this is interesting because you can still receive this payment for this rice diversion program if you use your rice fields and you produce rice, but you don't harvest it and sell it for human consumption. So if you sold it for ag purposes, for animal food, that sort of thing, then you can still receive this rice diversion program. So just an interesting side note. They have hazard insurance policies similar to our crop insurance policies. You get an indemnity payment for crop failure or livestock if you experience a natural disaster. And the government actually helps pay part of the premium on this, which is pretty nice. Well, I mean, if you're a producer, I guess. But just interesting that the government helps cover the cost of even the insurance to protect the farmers from risk. And then they do have government stockholding policies, which is something that I personally found really fascinating. So the government actually sets the prices for sugarcane, sugar beets, potatoes, and sweet potatoes for starch use specifically. So with this, they have some tariff rate quotas. And that covers rice flour, wheat flour, let's see, butter, milk powder, and sugar. So there's a fixed volume of product that you can import. And then after that import level has been reached, everything outside of that gets hit with a tariff so high that it pretty much completely inhibits trade. So they only import pretty much a set amount that is set by the government with that tariff rate quota. That's how that works. I'd be curious to see how this changes now with the CPTPP, since they're proposing that they're going to eliminate or reduce so many of their tariffs that they currently experience. And then there's a food department within the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, and basically it means they specifically look at an exclusive right to import rice, wheat, and barley outside of the tariff rate quotas. So this food department, basically, it's part of the government, and they have, what would you call it? It's like a state trading agency, kind of. So, like, imagine the government and the U.S. controlled all of our imports or exports for one commodity. That's basically what we're talking about here. And then the Ag and Livestock Industry Corporation is another kind of state trading agency that has exclusive import rights to dairy products specifically. So you can definitely see some protectionist policies there. I honestly can't imagine that in the U.S. I know there are some instances where that's happened in the past, but that's very different from some of the policies that we see now. Basically, the government, through these agencies, decides what, how much, and when to import these products. And then they also decide at what price they're willing to sell these products within the Japanese market. So some ag-specific information. Japan, like I mentioned in the geography section, has a lack of resources when it comes to land. And that's decreasing significantly with their rising population. Like I mentioned, they have over a third of the population that the U.S. does, but they only have that 150-some thousand square miles, whereas we're way over 3.5 million square miles. So huge difference, very urbanized. Those urban centers are growing. So that particularly is a high issue. As I mentioned a couple times before also, rice production's really high. Cereal grain production in general is fairly high. That's a big concentration, and they have a declining supply of animal-derived proteins. So that's something that's kind of a cultural change, and I think that might have to do more with changes in demand, especially in the younger generations. The FAO actually mentioned that there's an exponentially higher increase of women with anemia at a reproductive age. They're not eating a lot of that animal-derived protein, so they're not getting a lot of iron and some essential micronutrients. So that's an interesting cultural change that they've seen. A lot of these vegan trends and vegetarian trends. Sometimes that's something that you have to really focus on to get those nutrients in high quantities from other products. And then they've also seen a huge decline in rural population. So 94.3% of the total Japanese population is urban as of 2017. So that's a pretty high percentage. And like us, they're also seeing issues with the average age of their farmer. So in the US, we have an aging farmer population where a large majority of the farmers that are currently operating farms in the US are getting older and looking, more towards retirement and getting out of the industry. And that's the same in Japan. The average farmer's age is 65, and that's according to the United Nations. So they're going to be looking at some of the same problems we are um, as we're looking at this massive changeover in who basically controls our ag production. Um, it looks like, yeah, I'm not really sure what we're gonna what we're gonna see happening. I'd be curious to see if their government has specific policies for like changeover of land. I know in the U.S. we have issues when it comes to gifting land, inheriting large amounts of land, paying taxes on that sort of stuff. A lot of different a lot of different situations arise with that changeover. So I'm not entirely sure what Japanese government is doing to work on that, or if they're paying a lot of attention to that. I'm assuming they are. One thing that Japan does have that we don't is a really high level of fisheries. Again, their traditional diets focus a lot more on seaweed, nope, seafood, excuse me, and eating fish in general. Those white meats, really high in protein, lean. And so they do have a really high level of fisheries, especially in those areas that I mentioned that we're getting that northern current coming down. It brings a lot of nutrients and is really, really good for the fishing industry for them. Culture and society plays a lot of role as I've kind of moved into that a little bit here. Japanese cuisine in general is changing. The traditional Japanese cuisine is not really as much of a focus, especially with the younger population. The Japanese cuisine that we're seeing now is a